be able to look backward and say, this has been the finest year of my life, that is glorious. But anticipation, to be able to look ahead and say, the present year can and shall be better, that is even more glorious. If we said such things about our own achievements, we would become somewhat egotists. But if we are speaking of God's kindness, and we speak truly, we are but grateful. And this is what I do witness. I've done nothing but open the windows. God has done all the rest. There have been few, if any, conspicuous achievements. There has been a succession of marvelous experiences of the friendship of God. I feel, as I look back over the year, that it would have been impossible to have held much more without breaking with sheer joy. It was the lonesomest year in some ways, the hardest year of my life, but the most gloriously full of voices from heaven. And it closes very beautifully. The young men and girls of Solomon were gathered for a watch night service. We were resolving new high resolves until nearly 12 o'clock at night. As for me, I resolved that I would succeed better this year with my experiment of filling every minute full of the thought of God than I succeeded last year. And I added another resolve, to be as wide open toward people and their need as I am toward God. Windows open outward as well as upward. Windows especially open downward where people need most. January the 20th, 1930. Living in the atmosphere of Islam is proving thus far to be a tremendous spiritual stimulus. Muhammad is helping me. I have no more intention of giving up Christianity and becoming a Mohammedan than I had 20 years ago. But I find myself richer for the Islamic experience of God. Islam stresses the will of God. The will of God is supreme. We cannot alter any of his mighty decrees. To try to do so means annihilation. Submission is the first and last duty of man. That is exactly what I have been needing in my Christian life. Although I have been a minister and a missionary for 15 years, I have not lived the entire day, every day, minute by minute, in an effort to follow the will of God. 2 years ago, a profound dissatisfaction led me to begin trying to line up my actions with the will of God about every 15 minutes or every half hour. Other people to whom I confessed this intention said it was impossible. And I judge from what I have heard that very few people are really trying even that. But this year, I have started out trying to live all my waking moments in conscious listening to the inner voice, asking without ceasing, "What, Father, do you desire me to say? What, Father, do you desire me to do this minute?" It is clear now that this is exactly what Jesus was doing all day, every moment. But it is not what his followers have been doing in very large numbers. January the 26th, 1930. You who will read these letters will know that I am here exploring two lands which for me are new. One of them is within my own soul. The other is in the soul of the Moros of Mindanao. For the past few days, I have been experimenting in a more complete surrender than ever before. I am taking by deliberate act of will enough time from each hour to give God much thought. Yesterday and today, I have made a new adventure, which is not easy to express. I am feeling God in each movement by an act of will, willing that he shall direct these fingers that now strike this typewriter, willing that he shall pour through my steps as I walk, willing that he shall direct my words as I speak, and my very jaws as I eat. You will object to this intense introspection. Do not try it unless you feel dissatisfied with your own relationship with God, but at least allow me to realize all the leadership of God I can. I am disgusted with the pettiness and futility of my unled life. If the way out is not more perfect slavery to God, then what is the way out? Paul speaks of our liberty in Christ. I am trying to be utterly free from everybody, free from my own self, but completely enslaved to the will of God every moment of this day. We used to sing a song in the church in Benton, Pennsylvania, which I liked, but which I never really practiced until right now. It runs this way. Moment by moment, I've kept in his love. Moment by moment, I've life from above, looking to Jesus till glory doth shine. Moment by moment, O Lord, I am thine. It is exactly that moment by moment, every waking moment, surrender, responsiveness, obedience, sensitiveness, pliability, lost in his love, that I now have the mind bent to explore with all my might. It means two burning passions. First, to be like Jesus. Second, to respond to God as a violin responds to the bow of the master. In defense of my opening my soul and laying it bare to the public gaze in this fashion, I may say that it seems to me that we really seldom do anybody much good excepting as we share the deepest experiences of our souls in this way. It is not the fashion to tell your inmost thoughts, but there are many wrong fashions, and I think concealment of the best that is in us is wrong. I disapprove of the usual practice of talking small talk whenever we meet and holding a veil over our souls. If we are so impoverished that we have nothing to reveal but small talk, then we need to struggle for more richness of soul. As for me, I am convinced that the spiritual pilgrimage which I am making is infinitely worthwhile, the most important thing I know of to talk about, and talk I shall while there is anybody to listen. And I hunger, oh, I hunger for others to tell me their soul's adventures. Outside the window, as I completed the last page, has been one of the most splendorous sunsets I have ever seen. And these words came ringing through my soul, looking to Jesus till glory doth shine. Glory had been shining all across the sky until everything was crimson. Even the paper on which I was writing became red with the reflection from the roseate sky. It was the reflection of my own soul, where God had today been painting his wonderful visions. Is not this marvelous sky a parable? Open your soul, it says, and entertain the glory of God, and after a while that glory will be reflected in the world about you and in the very clouds above your head. January the 29th, 1930. I feel simply carried along each hour, doing my part in a plan which is far beyond myself. This sense of cooperation with God in little things is what so astonishes me, for I never have felt it this way before. I need something and turn around and find it waiting for me. I must work, to be sure, but there is God working along with me. To know this gives a sense of security and assurance for the future, which is also new to my life. I seem to have to make sure of only one thing now, and every other thing takes care of itself. Or I prefer to say, what is more true, God takes care of all the rest. My part is to live this hour in continuous inner conversation with God and in perfect responsiveness to His will, to make this hour gloriously rich with Him. This seems to me to be all I need to think about. February the 9th, 1930. I feel sure now that our thoughts flow around the world, even when we do not express them. And so I mean to make a contribution with my thoughts every hour. I am making a strenuous effort of will to concentrate upon people, those in my presence and those out of sight, in order to send to them my thoughts of Christ. I propose to think as hard of God as I can when in crowds, in the confidence that really dynamic thought will influence many others. Perhaps you have begun to suspect what tremendous dynamite lies hidden in this idea. If the Christian people, the really Christian people of the world, began to comprehend the power of thought, they could use it as a lever to lift the world. If people realize that telepathy is a fact, though as yet not reduced to law, that ought to be the signal for a tremendous movement among Christian people to keep their thoughts right, to make them helpful every hour from morning to night. We may yet attempt to make the world over by the sheer force of good thought. March the 1st, 1930. The sense of being led by an unseen hand, which takes mine while another hand reaches ahead and prepares the way, grows upon me daily. I do not need to strain at all to find opportunity. It piles in upon me as the waves roll over the beach. And yet there is time to do something about every opportunity. Perhaps a man who has been an ordained minister since 1914 ought to be ashamed to confess that he never before felt the joy of complete hourly minute by minute. Now what shall I call it? More than surrender. I had that before. More than listening to God. I tried that before. I cannot find a word that will mean to you or to me what I am now experiencing. It is a will act. I compel my mind to open straight out towards God. I wait and listen with determined sensitiveness. I fix my attention there. And sometimes it requires a long time early in the morning to attain that mental state. I determine not to get out of bed until that mind set, that concentration upon God is settled. It also requires determination to keep it there, for I feel as though the words and thoughts of others near me are constantly exerting a drag backward or sidewise. But for the most part, recently, I have not lost sight of this purpose for long, and I have soon come back to it. After a while, perhaps, it will become a habit, and the sense of effort will grow less. But why do I constantly harp upon this inner experience? It is because I feel convinced that for me and for you who read, there lie ahead undiscovered continents of spiritual living, compared with which we are infants in arms. And I must witness that people outside are treating me differently. Obstacles which I once would have regarded as insurmountable are melting away like a mirage. People are becoming friendly who suspected or neglected me. I feel like one who has had his violin out of tune with the orchestra and at last is in harmony with the music of the universe. As for me, I never lived. I was half dead. I was a rotting tree until I reached the place where I wholly, with utter honesty, resolved and then re-resolved that I would find God's will. And I would do that will, though every fiber in me said no. And I would win the battles in my thoughts. It was as though some deep artesian well had been struck in my soul, or soul, and strength had come forth. I do not claim success even for a day yet in my mind, not complete success all day. But some days are close to success, and every day is tingling with the joy of a glorious discovery. That thing is eternal. That thing is undefeatable. You and I shall soon blow away from our bodies. Money, praise, poverty, opposition, these make no difference, for they will all alike be forgotten in 1,000 years, and even in 100. But this spirit, which comes to a mind set upon continuous surrender, this spirit is timeless life. March the 9th, 1930. For the first time in my life, I know what I must do off in lonely Lanao. I know why God left this aching void for himself to fill. Off on this mountain, I must do 3 things. First, I must pursue this voyage of discovery in quest of God's will. I must, because the world needs me to do it. Second, I must plunge into mighty experiments in intercessory prayer to test my hypothesis that God needs my help to do his will for others, and that my prayer releases his power. I must be his channel, for the world needs me. Third, I must confront these Moros with a divine love which will speak Christ to them, though I never use his name. They must see God in me, and I must see God in them. Not to change the name of their religion, but to take their hand and say, "Come, let us look for God." A few days ago, as we came on the priests, they were praying in one boat with 35 Moros, many of whom called me to join them. So I held out my hands and prayed with them as earnestly as any of them. One of them said, "He is Islam," but I replied, "A friend of Islam." My teacher, Dado Pambaya, told me this week that a good Muslim ought to utter the sacred word of God every time he begins to do anything, to sleep, or walk, or work, or even turn around. A good Muslim will fill his life with God. I fear there are very few good Muslims. But so would a real Christ-like Christian speak to God every time he did anything. And I fear there are very few good Christians. What right then have I or any other person to come here and change the name of these people from Muslim to Christian, unless I lead them to a life fuller of God than they have now? Clearly, my job here is not to go to the town plaza and try to make proselytes. It is to live wrapped in God, trembling to his thoughts, burning with his passion. And, my loved one, that is the gift you can best give to your own town. I look up at this page, and it is not red hot as my soul is now. It is black ink. It ought to be written with the red ribbon. You will not see the tears that are falling on this typewriter, tears of a boundless joy broken loose. The most wonderful discovery that has ever come to me is that I do not have to wait until some future time for glorious hours. I do not sing, "Oh, that will be glory for me," and wait for any grave. This hour can be heaven. Any hour for anybody can be as rich as God. For do you not see that God is trying experiments with human lives? That is why there are so many of us. He has 1,700,000,000 experiments going on around the world at this moment. And his question is, how far will this man and that woman allow me to carry them this hour? This Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, he was asking that of us all. I do not know what the rest of you said, but as for me, I said, "God, how wonderful dost thou wish this hour alone with thee to be." It can be as wonderful as any hour that any human being ever lived. For I, who pushed life up through the protozoan and the tiny grass and the fish and the bird and the dog and the gorilla and the man, and who am reaching out toward divine sons, I have not become satisfied yet. I am not only willing to make this hour marvelous for you, God says, I am in travail to set you akindle with the Christ thing which has no name. How fully can you surrender and not be afraid? And I answered him, "Fill my mind with thy mind to the last crevice. Catch me up in thine arms and make this hour as terribly glorious as any human being ever lived, if thou wilt." And, oh God, I scarce see how one could live if his heart held more than mine has had for thee this past 2 hours. Will they last? Ah, that is the question I must not ask. I shall just live this hour until it is full, and then step into the next hour. Neither tomorrow matters nor yesterday. Every now is an eternity if it is full of God. But how practical is this for the average man? It seems to me now that yonder plowman could be like Calixto Sanadad when he was a lonesome and mistreated plowboy. He said, "I had my eyes on the furrow and my hands on the lines, but my thoughts on God." The carpenter could be as full of God as was Christ when he drove the nails as a carpenter's son. The millions at looms and lathes could make their hours glorious. Some hours spent by some night watchman might be the most glorious hour ever lived on this earth. God is not through yet. He's breaking through. And I think the poor have less callousness for him to overcome as a rule than have the rich. On the other hand, the rich man has the wonderful opportunity of paying a sacrifice which will cut his heart almost out. If he seeks the place where his wealth is needed most, then throws all he has into that cause, and then throws himself into the cause with his money, as Jesus asked the rich young ruler to do, his money will at that moment be transmuted into the golden threads of heaven. Maybe there is another way, but to me there seems only a blank wall for a wealthy man, save through the doorway I have entered, a sacrifice that hurts and hurts, and behind Calvary is God. Outside the sky is alight with golden sunset. To me, that is God working on the sky, as he has worked so wonderfully this afternoon within me. March the 15th, 1930. If these letters are to be given a name, I think it must be the story of a reconversion. For something of this sort is still in progress in me. This week a new and to me marvelous experience has come out of my loneliness. I have been so desperately lonely that it was unbearable save by talking with God. And so every waking moment of the week, I have been looking toward him, with perhaps the exception of 1 or 2 hours. Last Thursday night, I was listening to a phonograph in Laubach and allowing my heart to commune, when something broke in me, and I longed not only to lift my will up and give it completely to God, but also to lift all the wills in the world up and offer them all in utter surrender to him. To feel this great longing as I felt it then with all my being, to desire to put one's shoulder under all the world's hunger and need, and to carry it all to God, is not this the highest longing one can ever feel? Probably not. But it is the climax of my spiritual experience to this date. God, be the thought within my brain, and be the thought in every brain in the world, so that no thought save the thoughts of God shall take birth in any human mind. This will be heaven. How infinitely richer this direct first-hand grasping of God himself is than that old method which I used and recommended for years, the reading of endless devotional books. Almost it seems to me now that the very Bible cannot be read as a substitute for meeting God soul to soul and face to face. And yet how was this new closeness achieved? I know now that it was by cutting the very heart of my heart and by suffering. Somebody was telling me this week that nobody can make a violin speak. The last depths of human longing until that soul has been made tender by some great anguish. I do not say it is the only way to the heart of God, but I must witness that it has opened an inner shrine for me which I never entered before. March the 23rd, 1930. You and you and you and I do experience fine, fresh contact with God sometimes, and do carry out his will sometimes. One question now to be put to the test is this: can we have that contact with God all the time? All the time awake, fall asleep in his arms, awaken in his presence. Can we attain that? Can we do his will all the time? Can we think his thoughts all the time? Or are there periods when business and pleasures and crowding companions necessarily push God out of our thoughts? Someone will say, of course, that is self-evident. If one thinks of God all the time, he will never get anything else done. I thought that too until now, but I am changing my view. We can keep two things in mind at once. Indeed, we cannot keep one thing in mind more than half a second. Mind is a flowing something. It oscillates. Concentration is merely the continuous return to the same problem from a million angles. We do not think of one thing long. We always think of the relationship of at least two things, and more often of three or more things simultaneously. So my problem is this: can I bring God back in my mind flow every few seconds so that God shall always be in my mind as an after-image, shall always be one of the elements in every concept and every percept? I choose to make the rest of my life an experiment in answering this question. Someone may be saying that this introspection and this trouble to achieve God consciousness is abnormal and even perilous. I'm going to take the risk, for somebody ought to do it. In this day when psychological experimentation has given a fresh approach to our spiritual problems, if our religious premises are correct at all, then this oneness with God is the most normal condition one can have. It is what made Christ Christ. It is what St. Augustine meant when he said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our souls are restless until they find their rest in thee." I do not invite anybody else to follow this arduous path. I wish many might. We need to know so much which one man alone can never answer. For example, we need to know this: can a laboring man successfully attain this continuous surrender to God? Can a man working at a machine pray for people all day long, talk with God all day long, and at the same time do his task efficiently? Can a merchant do business? Can an accountant keep books, ceaselessly surrendered to God? Can a mother wash dishes, care for her babies, continuously talking to God? Can a politician keep in a state of continuous contact with God and not lose the following of the crowd? Can little children be taught to talk and listen to God inwardly all day long? And what is the effect upon them? Briefly, is this a thing which the entire human race might conceivably aspire to achieve? Do we really mean what we say when we repeat the words, "The highest end of man is to find God and to do his will all the time"? Do we really mean that? If you are like myself, this has been pretty strong diet this afternoon. It may even prove to be discouraging, and so I will put something simpler and more attainable before us. This is it: any hour of any day may be made perfect by merely choosing to make it perfect. It is perfect if one looks toward God that hour, waiting for his leadership all through the hour, and trying hard to do everything exactly as God wishes it done, as perfectly as possible. No emotions are necessary. Just the doing of God's will perfectly makes the hour a perfect hour, and the results of that one perfect hour, I believe, will echo down through eternity. April the 18th, 1930. I have tasted a thrill in fellowship with God which has made anything discordant with God disgusting to me. This afternoon, the possession of God has caught me up with such sheer joy that I thought I never had known anything like it. God was so close and so amazingly lovely that I felt like melting all over with a strange, blissful contentment. Having had this experience, which comes to me now several times a week, the thrill of filth repels me, for I know its power to drag me from God. And after an hour of close friendship with God, my soul feels clean, like new-fallen snow. Everywhere people are beautiful, or at least they have a beautiful side. On the boat from Manila last week was a painted woman alone. I spoke to her because she was lonesome. 3 of the ship's officers nearby tittered as though they thought a scandal was brewing, so I talked loud enough for them to hear. I told her I was looking for God. As naturally as a preacher, she replied, "God is everywhere around us and in us, if we only open our eyes, All the world is beautiful if we have eyes to see the beauty, for the world is packed with God. Thank you for that, I said. I love it. What are you going to do in Cebu? She said, I'm going to put on my special act. You see, I dance before 7 mirrors. Nobody else, so far as I know, in the whole world has this kind of an act. I am traveling alone. I make my own engagements, for it's too expensive to have a property man. I was treated wonderfully all through India. Wonderfully. I liked the way she pronounced that word, and the memories which lingered in her tired eyes. And many people in Manila wrote me lovely letters asking me to come back. Oh, she said, the world is full of good people, full of good people. When the dinner bell rang, I said, I'm going about the world trying to find wonderful hours, and I shall remember this one all my life. April the 19th, 1930. This conscious, incessant submission to God has proven extremely difficult, and I have surrendered for the past few days, and today and yesterday I saw evidences of the result. In an effort to be witty, I said biting things which have hurt the feelings of others and have been short and impatient. I trembled, for I have told at least one of these men of my experiment, and he will think this is the result. It's a very dangerous thing to tell people about this experiment, and yet I must tell them, and I must start over now and succeed. This philosophy that one can begin all over instantly at any moment is proving of great help to me with my experiment. If this record of a soul struggle to find God is to be complete, it must not omit the story of difficulty and failure. I have not succeeded very well so far. This week, for example, has not been one of the finest in my life, though it has been above the average. I shall have to make a greater effort next week. I have undertaken something which, at my age at least, is harder than I had anticipated, but I resolve not to give it up. Yet strain does not seem to do any good. At this moment, I feel something let go inside of me, and lo, God is here. It is a heart-melting here-ness, a lovely whispering of father to child. And the reason I did not have it before was because I failed to let go. And back of that failure there was something else. A crowd of people had arrived, who, when they were in a crowd, wished to talk or think nothing of religion. I fear I have not wanted some of them to think me religious, for fear I might cease to be interesting to them. Fellowship with God is something one dare not cover, for it smothers to death if you do. It is like a tender infant or a delicate plant, for a long nurturing is the price of having it, while it vanishes in a second of time. The very moment, indeed, one's eye ceases to be single. One cannot worship God and mammon, for the reason that God slips out and is gone as soon as we try to seek some other unworthy affection beside him. The other idol stays, and God goes. Not because God is a jealous God, but because sincerity and insincerity are contradictions, and they cannot both exist at the same time in the same place. April the 22nd, 1930. The experiment continues to be interesting, although I am not very successful thus far. This idea of God slips out of my sight for, I suppose, 2/3 of every day. This morning I started out fresh by finding a rich experience of God in the sunrise. And then I tried to let him control my hands while I was shaving and dressing and eating breakfast. Now I am trying to let God control my hands as I pound these typewriter keys. If I could keep this morning up, I should have a far higher average today than I've had for some time. This afternoon, as I look at the people teeming about me, and then think of God's point of view, I feel that this mighty stretch of time in which he has been pushing men upward is to continue for many more millions of years. We are yet to become what the spiritual giants have been, and more than many of them were. Here the selection favors those who keep themselves wide open toward God and wide awake. Our possibilities are perhaps not limitless, but they are at least infinitely above our present attainment. There is nothing that we can do excepting to throw ourselves upon God. There must be so much more of him than he can give us because we are sleepy, because our capacity is so pitifully small. It ought to be tremendously helpful to be able to acquire the habit of reaching out strongly after God's thoughts and to ask him, "Oh God, what have you to put into my mind now, if only I can be large enough to contain it?" That waiting, eager attitude ought to give God the chance he needs. I am finding every day that the best of the 5 or 6 ways in which I try to keep contact with God is for me to wait for his thoughts, to ask him to speak. May the 14th, 1930. Oh, this thing of keeping in constant touch with God, of making him the object of my thought, companion of my conversations, is the most amazing thing I ever ran across. But it is working. I cannot do it even half a day, not yet, but I believe I shall be doing it someday for the entire day. It is a matter of acquiring a new habit of thought. Now I like God's presence so much that when for a half hour or so he slips out of mind, as he does many times a day, I feel as though I had deserted him and as though I had lost something very precious in my life. I shall tell you some of the wonders presently, but just at this moment you must hear more of this sacred evening. The day had been rich but strenuous, so I climbed my signal hill back of my house, talking and listening to God all the way up, all the way back, all the lovely half hour on the top. And God talked back. I let my tongue go loose, and from it there flowed poetry far more beautiful than any I ever composed. It flowed without pausing and without ever a failing syllable for a half hour. I listened astonished and full of joy and gratitude. I wanted a dictaphone, for I knew I should not be able to remember it, and now I cannot. Why, someone may ask, did God waste his poetry on you alone when you could not carry it home? You will have to ask God that question. I only know he did, and I am happy in the memory. Below me lay the rice fields, and as I looked across them, I heard my tongue saying aloud to me, "Child, just as the rice needs the sunshine every day, and could not grow if it had sun only once a week or 1 hour a day, so you need me all day, every day." People over all the world are withering because they are open toward God only so rarely. Every waking moment is not too much. That is what God said to me through my own lips. A few days ago, I was trying to write a chapter on the discovering of God. And now I have discovered him, and I find that it is a continuous discovery. Every day is rich with new aspects of him and his wonder-working. As one makes new discoveries about his friends by being with them, so one discovers the individuality of God if one entertains him continuously. One thing I have seen this week is that God loves beauty. Everything he makes is lovely. The clouds, the tumbling river, the waving lake, the soaring eagle, the slender blade of grass, the whispering of the wind, the fluttering butterfly, this graceful, transparent, nameless child of the lake, which clings to my window for an hour and then vanishes forever. Beautiful craft, all of them, of God. And I know that he makes my thought life beautiful when I am open all day to him. If I throw these mind windows of mine apart and say, God, what shall we think of now? He answers always in some graceful, tender dream. And I know that God is love-hungry, for he is constantly pointing me to some dull, dead soul which he has never reached, and wistfully urges me to help him reach that stolid, tight-shut mind. Oh God, how I long to help you with these Moros, and with these Americans, and with these Filipinos. All day I see souls dead to God look sadly out of hungry eyes. I want them to know my discovery, that any minute can be paradise, that any place can be heaven, that any man can have God, that every man does have God the moment he speaks to God or listens for him. As I analyze myself, I find several things happening to me as a result of these 2 months of strenuous effort to keep God in mind every minute. This concentration upon God is strenuous, but everything else has ceased to be so. I think more clearly. I forget less frequently. Things which I did with a strain before, I now do easily and with no effort whatever. I worry about nothing, and I lose no sleep. I walk on air a good part of the time. Even the mirror reveals a new light in my eyes and face. I no longer feel in a hurry about anything. Everything goes right. Every minute I meet calmly as though it were not important. Nothing can go wrong excepting one thing, and that is that God may slip from my mind if I do not keep on my guard. If he is here, the universe is with me. My task is simple and clear, and I witness to the way in which the world reacts. Take Lanao and the Moros for illustration. Their responsiveness to me is a continuous source of amazement. I do nothing that I can see excepting to pray for them and to walk among them thinking of God. They know I am a Protestant, and yet 2 of the leading Muslim priests have gone around this province telling everybody that I would help the people to know God. June the 1st, 1930. Inwardly, this has been a very uneven week. As a whole, my end of the experiment has been failure for most of the week. My physical condition and too many distractions have proven too much for me, and God has not been in the center of my mind for even 1/5 of the time, perhaps not for 1/10 of the time. But today has been a wonderful day, and some of yesterday was wonderful. The week with its failures and successes has taught me one new lesson. It is this: I must talk about God or I cannot keep him in my mind. I must give him away in order to have him. That's the law of the spirit world. What one gives, one has. What one keeps to oneself, one loses. Do you suppose that all through eternity the price we will need to pay for keeping God will be that we must endlessly be giving him away? June the 3rd, 1930. This experiment which I am trying is the most strenuous discipline which any man ever attempted. I am not succeeding in keeping God in my mind very many hours of the day, and from the point of view of experiment number one, I should have to record a pretty high percentage of failure. But the other experiment, which happens when I do succeed, is so successful that it makes up for the failure of number one. God does work a change. The moment I turn to him, it is like turning on an electric current, which I feel through my whole being. I find also that the effort to keep God in my mind does something to my mind which every mind needs to have done to it. I am given something difficult enough to keep my mind with a keen edge. The constant temptation of every man is to allow his mind to grow old and to lose its keenness. Perhaps I am more lazy mentally than the average person, and perhaps I require the very mental discipline which this constant effort affords. So my answer to my two questions to date would be, first, can it be done all the time? Well, hardly. Second, does the effort help? Yes, tremendously. Nothing I have ever found proves to be such a tonic to my mind and my body. Sacred palaces for yourself. I meant to write places, to be sure, but I think I shall leave the word palaces, for that is what any house becomes when it is sacred. The most important discovery of my whole life is that one can take a little rough cabin and transform it into a palace just by flooding it with thoughts of God. When one has spent many months in a little house like this, in daily thoughts about God, the very entering of the house, the very sight of it as one approaches, starts associations which set the heart tingling and the mind flowing. I have come to the point where I must have my house in order to write the best letters or think the richest thoughts. So, in this sense, one man after the other builds his own heaven or his own hell. It does not matter where one is. One can at once begin to build heaven by thoughts which one thinks while in that place. I have learned the secret of heaven building anywhere. This morning I read a while about the tremendous consecration with which the scientists are studying the finest details about the sun in an effort to find out how to predict the weather and to know how to use its power. And I feel that not yet have I thrown myself into the crucible of this experiment of mind with all the abandon of the successful scientist. We have heard the saying, all a man's failures are inside himself, and I am willing to confess that as yet I have not striven unto blood to win this battle. What I want to prove is that the thing can be done by all people under all conditions, but I have not proven it yet. This much I do see, what an incredibly high thing Jesus did. A great lonesome hunger comes over me at this moment for someone who has passed through the same long, long channels of hope and aspiration and despair and failure, someone to whom I can talk tonight. And yet, there is no such person. As we grow older, all our paths diverge. And in all the world, I suppose, I could find nobody who could wholly understand me, excepting God. And I suppose you cannot find anyone who could understand you. Ah, God, what a new nearness this brings for thee and me, to realize that thou alone canst understand me, for thou alone knowest all. Thou art no longer a stranger, God. Thou art the only thing in the universe who is not partly a stranger. I invite others inside, but they cannot come all the way. Thou art all the way inside with me here. And every time I forget and push thee out, thou art eager to return. Ah, God, I mean to struggle tonight and tomorrow as never before, not once to miss thee. For when I lose thee for an hour, I lose, and the world loses more than we can know. The thing thou wouldst do can only be done when thou hast full sway all the time. June the 15th, 1930. I walk out in the street full of Moros, and if my soul is full of God, as it sometimes is, I see what happens as I look into the eyes of these Moros and pray for them. No man need try to persuade me that God does not reach them, for I see the thing happen. And now I know that every person we ever meet is God's opportunity. If only we were not so much of the time shut off from God. Last Monday was the most completely successful day of my life to date, so far as giving my day in complete and continuous surrender to God is concerned, though I shall hope for far better days in the future. And I remember how, as I looked at people with the love God gave me, they looked back and acted as though they wanted to go with me. I felt then that for a day I saw a little of that marvelous pull that Jesus had as he walked along the road day after day, God intoxicated and radiant with the endless communion of his soul with God. June the 22nd, 1930. I have just returned from a walk alone, a walk so wonderful that I feel like reducing it to a universal law, that all people ought to take a walk every evening all alone, where they can talk aloud without being heard by anyone, and that during this entire walk they all ought to talk with God, allowing him to use their tongues to talk back to them, and letting God do most of the talking. For this seems to be the very thing for which I have been feeling all these months. You have followed my experiment and have seen many confessions of daily failure as I tried to keep God in mind in the second person. Well, today has not been a failure. The thought of God has drifted occasionally from my mind, but not for long. But this day has been a different day from any other of my life, for I have not tried to pray in the sense of talking to God, but I have let God do the talking with my tongue, or in my inner life when my tongue was silent. It has been simple as opening and closing a swinging door, and without any of the old strain, the whole day passed beautifully, with God saying wonderful things. July the 2nd, 1930. The newest experiment and at present the most thrilling, is letting God talk through my tongue and through my own fingers on this typewriter. I have been letting my tongue talk on Signal Hill behind my house, and then I have come home and written on the typewriter all I could remember of what he said. Here is one thing he said. My child, I speak to you not through your tongue only, but also through everything which you see in nature, through the beauty of the sunset, through the little Moro boy who stands beside you without understanding what you are saying, and who wonders what you are looking at in the clouds. If I do not speak to you in words at times, it is because the reality all about you is greater than the imperfect symbols of things which you have in words. It is not necessary for your tongue to speak, nor even for any definite thoughts to enter your mind. For I myself am infinitely more important for you than anything I can give you, even more important than the most brilliant thoughts. So when thoughts do come, welcome them. And when they do not flow freely, simply rest back and love. And grant me the shared joy of being loved by you. For I too, by my very nature, am hungry with an insatiable hunger for the love of all of you, just as your love reaches out at your highest moments to all the people about you. O my child, even I, God, whom people have foolishly feared and flattered for my gifts, I want love and friendship more than I want groveling subjects. So while we love each other, my child, my share is as keen as yours. That is what God said to me tonight. I have written in this letter what my tongue said as I let it speak, not because I wish to recommend any of the above as prophetic, but simply because I think it may prove helpful to those who have been dissatisfied with their own contact with God and who may find this a helpful practice in making contact with Him. Day after day, I find this very helpful in little intimate personal ways which would have no value for other people. I am well aware of the probability of criticism because this is mysticism, as though any man could be a believer in Jesus without believing in mysticism, or because many people think that the days of direct contact with God, or at least words from God, stopped with the closing of the New Testament. February the 6th, 1931. Tonight, lonesome and half ill with a cold, I am learning from experience that there is a deep peace that grows out of illness and loneliness and a sense of failure. These things do drive me up my hill to God, and then there comes into my soul through the very tears a comfort which is much better than laughter. It is the peace of God that passeth all understanding. It passeth all understanding unless one has it. God cannot get close when everything is delightful. He seems to need these darker hours, these empty-hearted hours, to mean the most to people. You and I have known that over a coffin. We have known it when we parted and our hearts were sore. We have known it when we lay in bed helpless. Is this a deep truth in the very heart of nature? We sing, "Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, e'en though it be a cross that lifteth me." Is the cross the only doorway to the very heart of God? February the 10th, 1931. If there is any contribution that I have to make to the world that will live, surely it must be my experience of God on Signal Hill. This afternoon, I climbed my way to the top, weighted with a sense of remorse. Everything wrong that I have done in 20 years came back and made me feel like a dreadful sinner. I told God about it, but I do not intend to write any confessions here. We are so eager to judge people by their past, and it is not fair. We are what we are now, not an hour ago, and what we are planning to be, not what we are vainly trying to forget. As I stood on the top of the hill, very much inclined to let the tears break out of my eyes, my tongue stopped talking to God and began talking from God to me. And this is what he said. "Ah, little child, I have hurt you tonight, and now I feel sorry for you. All you have confessed to me is true, but I love you still. I love you for coming here and telling me the truth about it. I love you for hungering after me. I love you for being willing to be better. That is all I ask of people. Ah, I have wanted to do so much for you as soon as you would allow me to do it. Now, with a sore and lonesome heart, you are ready. And after this torture, I must pull you close to my heart, tiny little one." And into my heart there stole a new love for God that I never knew so strongly before. I felt like saying to him, "Oh God, I do not know thee, nor this universe, nor even my own self. Everything becomes more mysterious the longer I think about it. But I thank thee that Jesus showed us that thou art burning, yearning, eager love, longing to do more for us than thou canst do. Thou art like those plowmen who must break the soil and tear it apart before the seeds will grow. Thou hast plowed my heart tonight until it is tender and ready for something to grow. I thank thee, God. I thank thee, because I could not have felt thine healing hand if the pain had not been so acute. God, how can we reconcile this needed pain with our effort to abolish all misery?" The answer which came to me seemed to be convincing. He said, "If you abolish the physical suffering of the world, there will still be disappointed love, yearnings which cannot be satisfied, which will leave hearts bleeding even as they do today. Mansions have as many burning hearts as do poorhouses. The things which drag men down to grossness and incessant selfishness, these must be wiped out. Then hearts will become sore over infinitely larger things than just selfish needs. They will learn to bleed for a world like Jesus did." That is what God seemed to say to me. There will be more suffering than today, for only love knows how to suffer divinely. But the meanness, the sordidness of suffering for one's own selfish disappointments will be gone, and we will see a magnificence and sublimity in divine suffering that will make us glad. February the 25th, 1931. As I lay on the warm earth on Signal Hill last night, I asked God this question: "Why is it that thou dost allow us on this earth to do nearly all the talking? Why do we not always hear thy voice, since thou art so much wiser than we are? Instantly back came the answer. I could see it from the beginning to the end in a second, though it may require more than a minute to write it down. So many of these thoughts from God are hurled at me in an instant like that. This is what he said. When you are teaching the Moros to read, your art is to say as little as you can and leave them to say as much as they will. That is why I leave you to do and say as much as you can, while I say little. You are learning by doing. Even when you make mistakes and correct them, you are to be sons and daughters of God. My sons, my daughters. And now you are taking the first feeble steps of infants. Every step you take alone is infinitely more important than you now imagine, because the thing I am preparing you for exceeds all your imagination. So the talking you do to me is essential. The talking others do to you when they are trying to talk up to your expectations is more important than the talks you give to them. So this is the best way to act. Talk a great deal to me, and let others talk a great deal to you, appreciating every fine thing they say and neglecting their mistakes. March the 3rd, 1931. Oh, if we only let God have his full chance. He will break our hearts with the glory of his revelation. That is the privilege which a preacher can have above all others. It is his business to look into the very face of God until he aches with bliss. And that is how I feel this morning after 2 hours of wonderful thinking with God. And now on this Mount of Transfiguration, I do not want ever to lose you. I want to keep this lovely aching heart forever. But that would not be Christ-like. I must now carry all I can of him across the river to that Moro school. There are figures and there are salaries to be considered, for it is the end of the month. How much, I wonder, of this glory can one carry into his business life? April the 5th, 1931. We see ourselves on trial with Jesus. He could walk into the jaws of death to do his blessed work for others. He could dare to speak out against wrong and take the consequences. He could be flogged. He could allow men to spit in his face. He could endure the agony of thorns on his head. He could be taunted without a word or even a thought of anger. He could think of his mother while writhing on the cross. He could cry, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." I have read books which say that these words were evidently imaginary, for nobody could say anything when suffering the excruciating torture of hanging by nails. But Jesus was such an impossible person more than once in his life. This scene fits into his whole character. True, nobody else can think of others when suffering like that, but Jesus was better than the rest of us. Tragedy, magnificent horror, the best man who ever lived dying because he was too good to run away. That would have driven humanity more deeply into despair. They might or might not have remembered Jesus. I think they would have tried to forget him, for humanity wants to believe that God is good, and the crucifixion left by itself portrays God forsaking the finest example of loyalty in the world. God was betraying his staunchest defender if the cross ended all. That cross alone is horrible. The God who would allow the drama to stop there would be a monster or dead. My God, why? And so we cannot believe in a good God unless we have Easter. It is a difficult story to believe because we have nothing else quite like it before or since. But it is only the difficulty of believing the unprecedented. On the other hand, to doubt Easter is far more difficult. I must either rule out the whole story of the life of Jesus, or else rule out any intelligence or heart in the universe. And if I do that, my troubles are far more than intellectual. Now they become moral. I cannot actually sacrifice myself for others, or at least not to the death, for, noble as it may sound, it is folly if there be no Easter. The act of Jesus becomes not only rash and useless, but misleading to the rest of mankind. There must have been an Easter morning. How is it proved? It isn't proved, you fool. It can't be proved. How can you prove a victory before it's won? How can you prove a man who leads to be your leader worth following unless you follow him to the death and out beyond mere death, which is not anything but Satan's lie upon eternal life? And you want to argue? Well, I won't. It's a choice, and I choose Christ. That is what Studdard Kennedy said, and that is what I believe. That last sentence is the crux of the whole matter, for it is a choice. And while I realize that choosing Christ brings mystery, yet rejecting him brings utter despair. September the 28th, 1931. The fashion today is to place God in court and give him a trial. We have had such a lust for debunking every good and useful man in history that even God cannot escape it. It is one of the unfortunate byproducts of the quest for truth, plus a very unlovely hunger in humanity for scandal. It is a species of jealousy. We dislike to believe that anybody else is quite as good as we are, not even God. As for me, I choose to stop following this current, to stop posing as the judge of the universe. If it brought any good results, I might continue, but to date, it has carried us out into the desert and left us there. The books one reads all end on the desert. I choose another road for myself. I choose to look at people through God, using God as my glasses, colored with his love for them. Last year, as you know, I decided to try to keep God in mind all the time. That was rather easy for a lonesome man in a strange land. It has always been easier for the shepherds and the monks and the anchorites than for people surrounded by crowds. Today, it is an altogether different thing. I am no longer lonesome. The hours of the day from dawn to bedtime are spent in the presence of others. Either this new situation will crowd God out, or I must take him into every situation. I must learn a continuous, silent conversation of heart to heart with God while looking into other eyes and listening to other voices. If I decide to do this, it is far more difficult than the thing that I have been doing when I was alone. And yet, if this experiment is to have any value for busy people, it must be worked out exactly under conditions of high pressure and throngs of people. There is only one way to do it. God must share my thoughts of moral grammar and moral ethics and typesetting and teaching people to read and talking over the latest excitement with my family as we read the newspapers. And so I am resolved to let nothing stop me from this effort save sheer fatigue that stops all thought. One need not tell God everything about the people for whom one prays. Holding them one by one steadily before the mind and willing that God may have his will with them is, I think, the best. For God knows better than we do what our friends need. And yet our prayer releases his power. I know not how. I propose to make a strenuous effort of the will to concentrate upon every person I meet alone and to send him my thought of God. I propose to think as hard of the will of God as I can when I am in crowds. Thus, I hope to prove by experimentation what this will accomplish toward making a better world. This afternoon has brought a wonderful experience all inside my own mind. I closed my eyes to pray, and the faces of those before me, and then those in the houses nearby, and then those down the line and across the river, and down the highway to the next town, and the next, and the next, and then in concentric circles out around this lake, and over the mountains to the coast, and then across the sea to the north, and then over the wide ocean to California, and then across America to the people whom I know, and then on over to Europe to the people whom I have met there, and then to the Near East where my missionary friends live, and then to India where I have many other friends, and then to others in China, and to the multitudes who are suffering the dreadful pangs of cold and starvation. Around the world my mind went in less than a minute, and for a time the whole of my soul seemed to be lit up with a divine light as it held the world up to God. I cannot get God by holding him off at arm's length like a photograph, but by leaning forward intently as one would respond to one's lover. Love so insatiable as the love of God can never be satisfied until we respond to the limit, nor will he be satisfied until his aching arms receive my neighbors and all the surging multitudes of the world, all of us together responding to him and to one another. September the 28th, 1931. When one has struck some wonderful blessing that all mankind has a right to know about, no custom or false modesty should prevent one from telling it, even though it may mean the unbarring of his soul to the public gaze. I have found such a way of life. I ask nobody else to live it or even to try it. I only witness that it is wonderful. It is indeed heaven on earth, and it is very simple, so simple that any child could understand it and practice it. Just to pray inwardly for everybody one meets, and to keep on all day without stopping, even when doing other work of every kind. This simple practice requires only a gentle pressure of the will, not more than a person can exert easily. It grows easier, too, as the habit becomes fixed. And yet, it transforms life into heaven. Everybody takes on a new richness, and all the world seems tinted with glory. I do not, of course, know what others think of me, but the joy which I have within cannot be described. If there never were any other reward than that, it would more than justify the practice to me. Today I have noticed that when I forget other people, I become fatigued rather quickly. When I am reminded of my purpose and start again holding people, seen and unseen, up before God, a new exhilaration comes to me, and all the fatigue vanishes. October the 11th, 1931. Knowing God better and better is an achievement of friendship. When two persons fall in love, there may be such a strong feeling of fellowship, such a delight in the friend's presence, that one may lose oneself in the deepening discovery of another person. The self and the person loved become equally real. There are therefore three questions which we may ask. One is, do you believe in God? That is not getting very far. The devils believe and tremble. Second, are you acquainted with God? We are acquainted with many people with whom we have had some business dealing, and that is not going very far. Third, is God your friend? Or putting this another way, do you love God? It is this third stage that is really vital. How is it to be achieved? Precisely as any friendship is achieved, by doing things together. The depth and intensity of friendship will depend upon the variety and extent of the things which we do and enjoy together. Will the friendship be constant? That again depends upon the permanence of our common interests and upon whether or not our interests grow into ever-widening circles so that we do not stagnate. The highest friendship demands growth. It must be progressive as life itself is progressive. Friends must walk together. They cannot long stand still together, for that means death to friendship and to life. And friendship with God is the friendship of a child with its parent. As an ideal son grows daily in closer relationship with his father, understanding him better, so we may grow into closer love with God by widening into his large interests and thinking his great thoughts and sharing his magnificent enterprises. Far more than any other device of God to create love was the cross, where the lovingest person the world has known hangs loving through all his pain. That cross has become the symbol of our religion and of love for a third of the whole world, because it touches the deepest depths of human love. All I have said are mere words until one sets out helping God to right wrongs, helping God to help the helpless, loving and talking it over with God. Then there comes a great sense of the close-up, warm, intimate heart of reality. God simply creeps in, and you know he is here in your heart. He has become your friend because he is working with you. So if anybody were to ask me how to find God, I should say at once, hunt out the deepest need you can find in all the world. Forget all about your own comfort while you try to meet that need. Talk to God about it, and he will be there, and you will know it. January the 2nd, 1932. In school, a teacher lays out work for his pupils. I resolved to accept every situation of this year as God's layout for that hour, and never to lament that it is a very commonplace or disappointing task. One can pour something divine into every situation. One of the mental characteristics against which I have rebelled most is the frequency of my blank spells, when I cannot think of anything worth writing, sometimes cannot remember even people's names. Henceforth, I resolve to regard these also as God's signal that I am to stop and listen to him. Sometimes you want to talk to your son, and sometimes you want to hold him tight in silence. God is that way with us. He wants to hold us still and be still with us in silence. Here is something we can share with all the people of the world. All of them cannot be brilliant or rich or beautiful. All of them cannot even dream beautiful dreams like God gives some of us. They cannot all enjoy beautiful music. Their hearts do not all burn with love. But everybody can learn to hold God by the hand and rest. And when God is ready to speak, the fresh thoughts out of heaven will flow in like a crystal spring. Everybody rests at the end of the day. What a world gain if everybody could rest in the waiting arms of the Father and listen until he whispers.